In the year 1961, a woman in a plain grey habit walked into a small stone room beneath a convent in Rome, and she was never seen carrying anything valuable again, except for one thing, a single iron key that she wore against her chest for the next 40 years. And she never once explained what it opened, and when she died, that key disappeared with her. And to this day, nobody, not historians, not priests, not even the people who worked beside her for decades, can agree on what that key actually unlocked, because the vault it belonged to does not exist on any Vatican record, it is not in any archive, it is not in any official document, and yet 3 separate witnesses, on 3 separate occasions, decades apart, swore they saw her use it, and every single one of them described the exact same heavy wooden door hidden behind a wall that was not supposed to have a door at all. If that sounds impossible, stay with me, because before this video ends, you are going to hear the testimony of a Vatican archivist who resigned the week after he found her name in a file that was supposed to be empty, and you are going to hear why the Church has never once denied this story, not one single time, in over 60 years, and if a story about secret vaults and old keys and vanished nuns is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night wondering what else is being hidden in plain sight, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for, so hit that subscribe button right now before we go any further, because I am the secret nun, and every week I dig up the stories the Church would rather you forget, and this one might be the strangest of them all. Her name, according to the only surviving personnel record that mentions her directly, was Sister Domenica Maria Alterio, though even that name is disputed, because 2 other documents list her under a different surname entirely, and a third, found much later, does not list a surname at all, only the title custode, which in Italian simply means the keeper. She entered religious life in 1939, at the age of 19, in a small convent outside Naples, and for the first several years of her service, her file reads like the file of any other young nun of that era: quiet duties, kitchen work, care of the sick, nothing that would suggest she was destined for anything unusual at all. But then, in the spring of 1944, something happened that changed the entire trajectory of her life, and the strange part is, nobody wrote down what that something was. The record simply stops for 6 weeks. No entries. No notes. No mention of illness. No mention of travel, nothing. And when the entries pick back up again in the summer of that year, Sister Domenica is no longer at the convent outside Naples. She is in Rome. She has been transferred, quietly, without explanation, to a small religious house just a few hundred meters from Vatican territory, and from that point forward, her file becomes sparse in a very particular way. The way a file becomes sparse when someone higher up has decided that less written down is safer than more. Now, you might be thinking, wartime Italy, 1944, that was chaos, records were lost, people were moved constantly, this could just be a coincidence of history. And that is a fair thought, that is exactly the kind of thought the people who buried this story were counting on you having. But here is what makes it different. In 1944, Rome was under German occupation, and then liberation, and during that exact window, there is documented, verified history of the Vatican quietly moving and protecting things, art, documents, and according to a handful of post-war testimonies that never made it into mainstream history books, something else too, something that was never displayed, never catalogued publicly, never spoken of again once the war ended. And it is in this exact chaos, this exact 6-week gap, that a 19-year-old novice from outside Naples vanishes from her convent and reappears, transformed, in the shadow of the Vatican walls, with a new assignment that no one, not even other nuns who lived alongside her for the next 50 years, ever fully understood. What we do know comes from fragments, and I want to walk you through them one at a time, because each piece on its own sounds small, almost forgettable, but when you put them together, side by side, in order, they start to form a shape, and that shape is unmistakable. The first fragment comes from a nun named Sister Paola Ricci, who lived in the same religious house as Sister Domenica for nearly 2 decades, from the late 1940s into the mid-1960s. In an interview recorded by a local historian in the 1990s, long after both women were elderly, Sister Paola described her former housemate in a way that made the interviewer stop the tape and ask her to repeat herself. She said, and I am paraphrasing only slightly here, that Sister Domenica had duties that none of the other sisters had, that she left the house at odd hours, sometimes late at night, always alone, always in silence, and that when she returned, she never spoke of where she had been, not once. Not in 18 years of living under the same roof. Sister Paula said the other nuns learned, very quickly, not to ask. The second fragment comes from a maintenance worker, a man named Vittorio Bassano, who did repair work on a cluster of religious buildings near the Vatican throughout the 1950s and 60s. In a local newspaper interview from 1988, decades before anyone was connecting these dots into a single story, Bassano described being called in to fix a section of stone flooring in a basement corridor that, according to the building's own floor plans, should not have existed. He said the corridor led to a dead end, a solid wall, except it was not entirely solid, because there was a door built directly into the stone, seamless, painted to match, the kind of door you would only notice if you already knew it was there. He said a nun was present the entire time he worked, standing at a distance, watching him closely, never speaking except to tell him precisely where he was and was not permitted to touch. He remembered her because of her eyes, he said, calm but unmistakably alert, like someone guarding something far more important than an old stone wall. And here is the detail that should make the back of your neck go cold. When Bassano was later shown, decades afterward, a photograph of Sister Domenica Alterio from a religious archive, he identified her instantly, without hesitation, as the nun who had watched him that day. The third fragment is the one that pulls everything together, and it comes from someone whose credibility is much harder to dismiss, because this person was not a maintenance worker or an elderly nun recalling old memories. This person was a trained archivist who worked inside Vatican-affiliated records for over a decade. His name, in the limited public statements he gave before going almost completely silent on the subject, was Father Renato Calussi, and in the early 2000s, he was tasked with helping digitize a batch of older administrative files that were considered low priority, mostly logistics, mostly boring bureaucratic paperwork from the mid-20th century. And buried in one of those files, misfiled, out of place, was a single sheet of paper, unsigned, undated except for a partial year stamp reading 1944, that referred to something called Illinois Deposito Custodito, the guarded deposit, and beneath that phrase was a single handwritten note assigning responsibility for its access to Sua Da, Sister Da, initials that matched Domenica Alterio precisely. Father Calussi has said, in the only interview he ever gave on the subject before requesting no further contact from journalists, that he brought this document to his supervisor, expecting a simple explanation, expecting to be told it referred to some mundane wartime storage of church valuables, art, silver, the kind of thing institutions protected during conflict all the time. Instead, he said, his supervisor took the document from him, told him it had been misplaced and should never have reached the digitization batch, and asked him to forget he had seen it. Calussi resigned from his position 11 days later. He has never publicly explained why, but he has also, notably, never denied that this incident is connected to his resignation when directly asked, and in the world of quiet Vatican departures, that kind of non-denial speaks louder than most confessions ever could. So let's slow down for a second and actually think about what we're looking at here, because I don't want you to just take this in as a spooky collection of anecdotes. I want you to feel the weight of what these three fragments mean when they're placed together. A teenage nun disappears for 6 weeks during the most chaotic period of wartime Rome. She reappears transformed, reassigned to Vatican-adjacent territory, given duties so secretive that even the women she lived beside for 2 decades knew nothing about them. A construction worker independently confirms, without any knowledge of her identity at the time, that she guarded access to a hidden door built into a wall that officially does not exist. And an internal archivist, working decades later, stumbles onto a single surviving document that directly ties her initials to something called the guarded deposit, a phrase found nowhere else, in any other record, before or since. 3 unconnected people. 3 unconnected decades. 1 consistent story. Now, I know what some of you are already asking, and it's the obvious question, the one that any reasonable person would ask at this point in the story. What could possibly be important enough, secretive enough, to require a single, silent guardian for over 50 years? Gold doesn't need a lone nun standing watch in the dark. Gold needs a bank vault and armed guards and insurance paperwork. Art doesn't need this kind of secrecy either. The Vatican has entire departments dedicated to cataloging and protecting art, openly, proudly, as part of its identity. Whatever this was, it wasn't something you protect with visible security. It was something you protect by making sure almost nobody even knows it exists in the first place. And that distinction, that specific kind of secrecy, is what separates ordinary institutional caution from something else entirely, something closer to containment. There are, as you'd expect with a story like this, a handful of competing theories, and I want to walk through the most credible ones with you honestly, because I think you deserve to hear the strongest version of each idea rather than a simplified version designed to make one theory look more exciting than the others. The first theory, and probably the most grounded one, is that the vault contained sensitive wartime documentation, records that, if they had surfaced in the chaotic years immediately after World War II, could have caused significant damage, not necessarily to the Church's spiritual authority, but to its political relationships, its diplomatic standing, the delicate web of alliances and silences that every major institution navigates during and after a global conflict. Under this theory, the guarded deposit wasn't treasure in the traditional sense at all, it was information, paper, names, correspondence, the kind of material that becomes more dangerous with time rather than less, because the people it could implicate are still alive, still influential, still capable of being embarrassed or exposed for decades after the war technically ended. This theory fits neatly with the timing, 1944, the exact hinge point of the war in Italy, when documents were being moved, hidden, and in some documented cases destroyed, by every major institution operating in the region. The second theory is more unsettling, and it leans on something that has actually been documented in other, unrelated contexts involving the Vatican's historical relationship with secrecy, and that is the protection not of documents but of relics or artifacts whose authenticity, if publicly challenged or scientifically tested, could undermine specific, deeply held beliefs. Under this theory, the vault held something physical, something with religious significance so profound that the institution decided the safest path forward was not public display and veneration, but complete and total silence, an object too sacred to expose to scrutiny, and too dangerous to destroy. This theory is harder to prove, obviously, because by its very nature it requires believing in the existence of something nobody has ever seen or described in physical detail. But it does explain one thing the other theories struggle with, and that is why a single trusted individual, rather than a full security detail, was chosen to guard it. A large security presence draws attention. A quiet nun, walking silently through corridors late at night, draws none at all. The third theory, and the one that some researchers find most compelling precisely because it's the least dramatic, is that the vault contained financial records tied to Vatican bank activity during and immediately after the war, a period that has been the subject of legitimate, well-documented historical controversy regarding the movement of funds and assets through Vatican channels during a time of extraordinary chaos across Europe. If this theory is correct, then the guarded deposit wasn't mystical or sacred at all, it was simply financially and politically radioactive, the kind of paperwork that, if it ever became public, could reopen investigations, damage reputations, and complicate relationships that had taken decades to quietly stabilize. Under this theory, Sister Domenica wasn't guarding a secret of faith, she was guarding a secret of money, and honestly, when you look at how most institutional secrets throughout history have actually played out, that theory might be the most believable of all, even if it's the least exciting to imagine. But here's what none of these three theories fully explain, and it's the detail that keeps this story from settling into any single neat explanation, and that is the sheer duration of the secrecy. If this was wartime documentation, most sensitive wartime secrets, however damaging, tend to lose their explosive power within a generation or two, as the people involved pass away and the political landscape shifts. If this was a controversial relic, the Church has, historically, found ways to eventually address or reframe controversial religious objects rather than maintain permanent silence for over half a century. And if this was financial material, financial scandals, however serious, don't typically require a single individual guardian holding a physical key for 5 decades, they require lawyers, paper shredders, and quiet settlements. The length and the method of this secrecy, one woman, one key, one door, unchanged for 50 years, suggests something that none of the three theories fully capture on their own, and that is a level of institutional discipline and continuity that goes far beyond simply hiding an embarrassing document or a fragile belief. It suggests a system, a deliberate, generational system, built specifically to ensure that whatever was behind that door would remain behind that door for as long as humanly possible, regardless of who was Pope, regardless of what era passed, regardless of how much the world outside those walls changed. And that brings us to the part of the story that I think is the most quietly disturbing of all, and it's something that almost gets lost in the drama of the earlier fragments, because it's not dramatic, it's administrative, and administrative details are the ones that are usually the most honest. When Sister Domenica Alterio died, in the year 2001, at the age of 81, her death was recorded, briefly, in the internal records of the religious house where she had spent the final decades of her life. The entry is short, respectful, entirely ordinary, the kind of entry written for any elderly nun who passes peacefully after a long life of service. There is nothing in that entry that hints at any of what we've just discussed. No mention of guarded deposits. No mention of hidden doors. No mention of a key. But two other nuns who were present in the house at the time of her death, both of whom later spoke, carefully and separately, to a researcher compiling oral histories of the community, described something that never made it into any official record at all. They said that within hours of her death, before her body had even been formally prepared, two men arrived at the house, men neither nun recognized, dressed simply, saying almost nothing, and that these men spent nearly an hour alone in Sister Domenica's private room before leaving quietly, the same way they had arrived. Neither nun could say for certain what the men took, if anything, because neither of them was permitted into the room while the men were inside. But both of them, independently, when asked years later whether they believed the men had come for the key, gave almost the exact same answer, phrased in almost the exact same words, and that answer was simply, what else would they have come for? If that alone doesn't send a chill through you, consider this. If the key was retrieved that quickly, that quietly, by men who were clearly expected, clearly authorized, clearly aware of exactly where to look and exactly what they were looking for, then whatever system was built around Sister Domenica in 1944 did not end with her. It transferred. Someone, somewhere, within an institution known for its long memory and its longer patience, knew precisely what to do the moment she died, which means the guarding of that vault, whatever it contains, whatever it has always contained, almost certainly continued after her, under a new guardian, in a new decade, behind the exact same unmarked door. Before we get to what happened after her death, I want to take you deeper into who Sister Domenica actually was as a person, because it's easy, when you're telling a story like this, to turn a real human being into nothing but a mystery, a symbol, a plot device in someone else's secret, and I don't want to do that to her, because the fragments we do have of her personality tell a story of their own, one that makes the weight of what she carried even harder to sit with. The nuns who remembered her, the handful who were still alive when researchers started asking questions in the late 1990s and early 2000s, described her in strikingly consistent terms, even though none of them, as far as anyone can tell, ever compared notes with each other beforehand. They said she was calm, almost unsettlingly calm, the kind of calm that comes from certainty rather than emptiness. They said she rarely laughed, but when she did, it came suddenly, warmly, like something briefly escaping from behind a door she kept shut the rest of the time, which, if you think about it, might be the most fitting detail in this entire story. They said she prayed for long stretches, longer than most of the other sisters, often alone, often at hours when the rest of the house was asleep, and that she never once, in decades of shared meals and shared labor and shared grief over the sisters who passed before her, spoke about her own family, her own childhood, or the 6 weeks in 1944 that changed the entire direction of her life. One sister, in a fragment of testimony that almost didn't survive because the recording it came from was nearly lost in a basement flood decades later, remembered asking Sister Domenica directly, once, gently, why she so often left the house at night. She said Sister Domenica looked at her for a long moment, longer than felt comfortable, and then said only this, translated roughly from the Italian, "Some doors are kept closed so that others may stay open." Nothing more. No explanation. No follow-up conversation. The sister who remembered this said she never asked again, not because she was afraid, but because something about the way it was said made it clear that asking again would be its own kind of intrusion, a violation of something sacred that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with respect. That single sentence, "Some doors are kept closed so that others may stay open," has become, among the small community of researchers and amateur historians who've spent years chasing this story, something close to a mantra, because it's the closest thing we have to Sister Domenica explaining, in her own words, why she did what she did. It suggests she wasn't simply following orders out of blind obedience. It suggests she understood, on some level, the trade she was making, that her 50 years of silence, her 50 years of solitary nighttime walks through cold stone corridors, her 50 years of carrying a secret so completely that not even her closest companions ever glimpsed the edges of it, existed in service of something larger, something she believed was worth the sacrifice of an ordinary life. Whether that belief was justified, whether whatever lies behind that door was truly worth half a century of one woman's silence, is a question none of us can answer, because we don't know what she knew, and that, more than any locked door or carved word in stone, might be the real mystery at the center of this entire story. Now let's talk about the broader pattern this story fits into, because Sister Domenica was not, as strange as this might sound, entirely unique in the history of the Church. Religious institutions, across centuries and across continents, have a long, well-documented tradition of assigning individual custodians to specific sacred or sensitive responsibilities, quiet roles that exist almost entirely outside public awareness, roles passed down not through open announcement but through private selection, sometimes by a single superior, sometimes through a small, closed circle of trusted elders. Monasteries have kept relic keepers for centuries, individuals responsible for the safekeeping of bones, cloth fragments, and objects believed to hold spiritual significance, and in many documented cases, these keepers were instructed to reveal almost nothing about their duties to the wider community, precisely to prevent theft, precisely to prevent the kind of curiosity that leads to exposure. In that light, what happened to Sister Domenica in 1944 doesn't look like an isolated anomaly. It looks like the activation of a very old, very deliberate institutional pattern, one that has simply, historically, remained far better hidden than most people realize, surfacing only in fragments, only when something goes slightly wrong, only when a maintenance worker notices a door that shouldn't exist, or an archivist stumbles onto a page that was supposed to have been removed. This is what makes Father Kalas's account so important, and I want to go a little deeper into what he actually described, because the detail of the document itself matters more than I initially let on. The page he found wasn't just a single unsigned note. According to his account, it was attached, loosely, almost as an afterthought, to a much larger bundle of administrative correspondence dealing with property transfers in post-war Rome, mundane paperwork about buildings changing hands, about religious houses being repaired and reassigned after the disruption of the war. In other words, whoever filed this document decades earlier had made an active choice to bury it inside something boring, something nobody would ever have reason to read closely, which is, when you think about it, a remarkably effective strategy, because it worked for nearly 60 years. It was only the accident of digitization, the slow, methodical, almost mechanical process of scanning old paperwork page by page, that ever exposed it at all, and even then, it was noticed by exactly one person, out of what was presumably a small team, a person curious enough, or perhaps simply attentive enough, to stop and actually read a page that everyone else might have scanned and moved past without a second thought. Kalasi has said that the phrase Illinois Deposito Custodito appeared nowhere else in any of the surrounding documents, no earlier reference, no later follow-up, nothing that would explain what it meant in context. It existed, as far as he could tell, entirely alone, a single sentence floating inside decades of unrelated bureaucratic paperwork, like a message someone had deliberately hidden inside a haystack of the most boring possible material, betting, correctly, that almost nobody would ever have the patience to find it. And when he brought it to his supervisor, expecting, as any reasonable person would, a simple bureaucratic explanation, he instead got silence, followed by the quiet, immediate removal of the document from the batch, followed, less than 2 weeks later, by his own resignation. Now, I want to be fair here, because responsible storytelling means acknowledging the version of events that doesn't involve a conspiracy, and it would be irresponsible not to mention it. It is entirely possible that Kalas's supervisor removed the document simply because it was irrelevant, poorly preserved, or genuinely unrelated to the digitization project's actual scope, and that Kalasi, already dealing with unrelated professional frustrations, chose to resign for reasons that had nothing to do with this specific incident. Institutions lose paperwork constantly. Supervisors make careless, defensive decisions about ambiguous documents all the time, not because they're hiding some grand secret, but because bureaucracies are, by nature, deeply allergic to anything that creates more questions than it answers. It's possible this was nothing more than ordinary institutional clumsiness, dressed up, decades later, into something far more sinister than it ever actually was. But here's the detail that keeps pulling me back toward the less comfortable interpretation, and it's this. Kalussi never went on to build a public career around this story. He never sold a tell-all account. He never appeared on a dozen different documentaries offering increasingly dramatic versions of what he witnessed. He gave one interview, years after the fact, answered a handful of careful questions, declined to speculate beyond what he had personally seen and personally been told, and then, by every account, simply stepped back from public life on the subject entirely, declining every request for further comment since. That is not the behavior pattern of someone chasing attention or fabricating a story for personal gain. That is the behavior pattern of someone who saw something they weren't supposed to see, said the minimum required to be honest about it once, and then decided, quietly, that saying anything more wasn't worth whatever risk came attached to it. And that brings us back to the corridor itself, because I haven't told you everything about what happened to that space after Vittorio Bassano's repair work in the 1950s, and this next part is where the story takes a turn that, honestly, still unsettles me every time I go back over the research. In the early 1970s, nearly 20 years after Bassano's original repair, city records show a formal request for structural inspection filed for the same general area, part of a routine safety review conducted across several older buildings near Vatican territory following concerns about foundation stability in the district. The inspection request exists in public municipal archives, ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of document nobody would ever think twice about. But the follow-up report, the actual findings of that inspection, does not exist in the same archive. It was requested, formally, by a researcher in 2009, and the response from the municipal office was that the corresponding file had been withdrawn at the request of the property's religious administration, a phrase that, under Italian municipal procedure, is unusual specifically because it requires a formal justification, one that, when the same researcher requested to see it, was denied on the grounds of what was described only as administrative privacy. Think about what that actually means. A public safety inspection was conducted. Its findings were then formally, legally withdrawn from public record, at the specific request of the religious institution that owned the property, using a bureaucratic mechanism that exists, but is used exceptionally rarely, specifically because most religious properties have no legal reason to withdraw ordinary structural inspection results. Whatever that inspection found, in the early 1970s, in the exact section of building where Vittorio Bassano had encountered a hidden door 20 years earlier, someone with institutional authority decided it needed to disappear from the public record entirely, permanently, using formal legal channels rather than simple neglect or oversight. This isn't a case of paperwork getting lost in the chaos of history. This is a deliberate, documented act of withdrawal, and it happened at almost exactly the point in time when Sister Domenica would have been roughly 50 years old, still very much active in her role, still very much the sole guardian of whatever lay behind that seamless stone door. I keep returning to this detail because it does something the earlier fragments don't quite do on their own. It proves institutional awareness beyond just Sister Domenica and whoever originally assigned her in 1944. It proves that decades later, in the 1970s, someone within the religious administration was still actively monitoring, still actively protecting, still actively willing to use formal legal mechanisms to keep information about that specific space out of public reach. This wasn't a forgotten wartime arrangement slowly fading into irrelevance. This was a living, maintained system, decades after its creation, decades before Sister Domenica's death, decades before the two unidentified men arrived at her room within hours of her passing to, presumably, retrieve exactly what they came for. This is the point in the story where I have to be honest with you about something, and it's important, because I think it actually makes this story more credible rather than less. There is no confirmed evidence, none, that identifies who took over after Sister Domenica's death. No maintenance worker has come forward describing a new nun standing watch over that same corridor. No archivist has stumbled onto a fresh document with new initials attached to Illinois Deposito Custodito. As far as any outside observer can tell, the trail goes cold in 2001, the exact moment she died, and it has stayed cold ever since. Now, you can read that in two very different ways. You could read it as evidence that the whole system quietly wound down after her, that whatever she was guarding was eventually moved, resolved, or rendered irrelevant, and that the men who came to her room that day were simply closing out an old, forgotten arrangement rather than beginning a new one. Or, and this is the interpretation that I find far more unsettling, you could read the silence itself as the strongest evidence yet that the system is still active, because the entire point of this arrangement, from the very beginning, was that it should never be visible, never be documented, never leave a trail for people like us to follow. If that's true, then the absence of a new Sister Domenica isn't proof that the guarding stopped. It's proof that whoever replaced her is simply better hidden than she ever was, learning, perhaps, from the very fragments of exposure that allowed this story to be pieced together in the first place. I want to bring you back, for a moment, to that basement corridor Vittorio Bassano described, the one with the seamless stone door built into a wall that officially doesn't exist, because there's one more detail from his account that I deliberately saved for later in this story, and it's the detail that, for me, ties everything together more tightly than anything else we've discussed. Bassano said that while he was working, he noticed something carved into the stone frame surrounding that hidden door, small, worn, easy to miss unless you were close enough and paying attention, which he was, because repair work requires exactly that kind of attention. It wasn't a religious symbol, not a cross, not any recognizable church iconography at all. It was a single word, in Latin, carved directly into the stone, and the word was Silentium. Silence. Not a warning. Not a name. Not a date. Just a single instruction, carved permanently into the frame of a door that isn't supposed to exist, guarding something the church has never acknowledged, watched over for over 50 years by a woman who never once explained herself to anyone, not to the sisters she lived beside for 2 decades, not to the maintenance worker who fixed the floor outside her post, not even, as far as any surviving record shows, to her own religious superiors in writing. Silence wasn't just the atmosphere surrounding this story. It was, quite literally, carved in stone as its entire purpose. So where does that leave us, sitting here, all these years later, trying to make sense of fragments that were never meant to be assembled in the first place? I think it leaves us with a story that is uncomfortable precisely because it refuses to resolve. We don't get a satisfying reveal at the end of this one. We don't get to open the door ourselves. We are left, much like Vittorio Bassano was left standing in that basement corridor, staring at a wall that looks solid until you know exactly where to press, aware that something is there, aware that someone built it deliberately, aware that someone has been maintaining that secrecy for generations, and yet completely unable to see past the surface ourselves. And maybe that is exactly the point. Maybe some institutions understand something that we, as curious outsiders, often forget, and that is that the most effective way to protect a secret isn't to make it impossible to find. It's to make it so quiet, so unremarkable, so wrapped in the ordinary rhythms of daily religious life, that almost nobody ever thinks to look in the first place. A young nun doing kitchen work. A quiet transfer during wartime. Odd hours, unexplained absences, the kind of behavior that, in any other context, would raise immediate questions, but inside the deeply private world of religious life, simply blends into the background, unremarked, unquestioned, for 50 years. There's one more thread to this story that I've saved for now, because I think it needs its own space to breathe, and it comes from a source that, for a long time, researchers dismissed almost entirely, until a series of small, independent confirmations made it much harder to ignore. In 2013, a retired schoolteacher named Elena Ferraro, living in a small town outside Rome, came forward with a story about her aunt, a woman who had spent time in the same religious community as Sister Domenica during the 1950s before leaving religious life entirely and marrying a local farmer, a decision that, at the time, would have required significant courage and almost certainly involved some degree of institutional disapproval. Elena's aunt, whose name she asked researchers not to publish out of respect for the privacy of her remaining family, apparently spoke about her time in the convent only rarely, and always in careful, measured tones, but on one occasion, near the end of her life, in a moment of unusual openness that sometimes comes with old age and the sense that there's little left to lose by finally speaking honestly, she told her niece something that had clearly stayed with her for over half a century. She said that during her time in the community, there had been a night, one single night, when the entire house was woken by the sound of raised voices coming from deep within the building, voices that did not belong to any of the sisters, voices that were unmistakably male, sharp, urgent, arguing about something in a mixture of Italian and what she believed, though she couldn't be certain after so many decades, was German. She said the sisters were instructed the next morning, quietly, firmly, by the Mother Superior, never to speak of what they had heard, and that no explanation was ever given, then or later. She said Sister Domenica was notably absent from morning prayers that day, the only time in years of shared religious life that anyone could recall her missing that particular obligation, and that when she reappeared later that afternoon, she looked, in her aunt's words, like someone who had been standing too close to a fire. Now, this account is second-hand, filtered through decades of memory and then through a niece's recollection of a conversation that happened near the end of her aunt's life, and I want to be upfront about those limitations, because responsible storytelling requires it. Memory is imperfect. Language barriers between Italian and German, especially overheard through thick stone walls in the middle of the night, are exactly the kind of detail that could easily be misremembered or reconstructed over time into something more dramatic than what actually happened. But here's what makes this account worth including rather than dismissing entirely, and it's the timing. Elena Ferraro came forward with this story in 2013, a full 4 years before a completely unrelated researcher, working independently, uncovered a fragment of correspondence, unrelated to Sister Domenica directly, suggesting that in the early 1950s, there had been quiet, unofficial contact between certain religious intermediaries in Rome and individuals connected to post-war restitution disputes involving property, assets, and documentation displaced across Europe during the war, some of it never fully resolved even decades later. Elena had no way of knowing about this later discovery when she first told her story. The two pieces of information exist entirely independently of each other, discovered years apart, by different people, through completely different research paths, and yet they fit together with an unsettling neatness, suggesting that whatever happened that night, whatever those raised voices were arguing about, may have been directly connected to exactly the kind of post-war restitution tension that would explain why an institution might feel compelled to protect certain records so carefully, for so long, from so many different directions at once. If that's true, it adds another dimension to the financial theory we discussed earlier, one that's more specific, more historically grounded, and frankly more disturbing than simple institutional embarrassment over old paperwork. Post-war restitution, the process of identifying, returning, or accounting for property and assets displaced, seized, or hidden during the war, remains, even today, a legally and politically sensitive subject across much of Europe, one that has led to real lawsuits, real diplomatic tension, and real reputational damage for institutions found to have played any role, however small, in delaying or obstructing that process. If the vault beneath that unmarked corridor contains documentation connected to this kind of history, records of assets moved, hidden, or never properly returned during the chaos of 1944, then the 50-year silence around Sister Domenica's role stops looking like an unusual, isolated arrangement, and starts looking like a carefully maintained firewall, protecting not just an old secret, but an ongoing legal and moral liability that could still, even today, have real consequences if it were ever fully exposed. I want to pause here and acknowledge something important, because I think it's easy, when you're deep inside a story like this, to let the darker theories completely take over the narrative, and I don't think that would be fair or accurate. It's entirely possible, even likely, that we will never know which of these theories, if any, is correct, and it's worth remembering that institutions this old carry centuries of accumulated secrecy for all kinds of reasons, some sinister, some simply cautious, some rooted in traditions so old that even the people currently maintaining them may not fully understand why they started in the first place. Silence, especially institutional silence maintained across generations, doesn't always mean guilt. Sometimes it means fear of misunderstanding. Sometimes it means an old, rigid commitment to privacy that outlived the original reasons for it entirely. But even accounting for that uncertainty, even holding space for the more innocent explanations, the sheer specificity of what we've uncovered, the timing, the withdrawn municipal records, the unsigned document, the consistent physical descriptions from multiple independent witnesses across multiple decades, makes it very hard to walk away from this story believing it was nothing at all. Let's talk about what happened after 2001, because while the public trail on Sister Domenica's successor goes cold, as I mentioned earlier, there is one final piece of information that surfaced much more recently, in 2019, and it comes from an unexpected place, A small local news article covering, of all things, a minor dispute over building renovation permits near Vatican-adjacent property. The article, brief and entirely focused on mundane zoning issues, mentions in passing that renovation work on a specific religious building was delayed for several months due to what the article describes only as access restrictions related to a section of the lower structure currently under continued religious administration, a phrase so deliberately vague that it would mean nothing at all to anyone not already familiar with this story. But to researchers who had spent years tracing every scrap of information connected to Sister Domenica's story, that phrase, continued religious administration, attached to a building in the exact same district, describing restricted access to a lower structural section, as recently as 2019, nearly 2 decades after her death, was impossible to read as coincidence. It doesn't prove the vault is still active. It doesn't prove there's a new guardian walking those same corridors today. But it does prove, at minimum, that whatever arrangement existed around that space has not been fully dismantled, has not been quietly abandoned, has not simply faded into an old, forgotten footnote of post-war history the way so many similar wartime secrets eventually do. As recently as 2019, someone was still managing access to that specific space, still using careful, deliberately uninformative language to describe why, still treating it as a matter requiring active religious administration rather than ordinary property management. Whatever began in 1944, with a 19-year-old novice disappearing for 6 weeks and reappearing transformed, does not appear to have ended with her death in 2001. It appears, as unsettling as this is to sit with, to still be quietly continuing today, in some form, behind some door, under someone's careful, silent watch, exactly the way it was designed to from the very beginning. I keep coming back to one image from this story, more than any other, and it's not the hidden door, and it's not the carved word in the stone. It's the image of an elderly woman, in her final years, still walking those same corridors late at night, alone, carrying a key she had carried for over half a century, knowing that she was likely the only living person on earth who fully understood what it opened, and choosing, every single day, for 50 years, to tell absolutely no one. Not out of fear, as far as any witness could tell, but out of something that looks, from the outside, remarkably like devotion, the kind of quiet, unglamorous devotion that never asks for recognition, that expects no reward, that simply does the job it was given because someone, somewhere, decided a long time ago that the job mattered more than any explanation ever could. Let's talk, for a moment, about the key itself, because in all the discussion of hidden doors and withdrawn municipal records and mysterious men arriving within hours of a death, it's easy to forget that the object at the very center of this entire story is something almost absurdly small, almost domestic in its ordinariness, and yet it's the one physical thing that ties every single fragment of this story together. According to Sister Paula Ricci's account, the key Sister Domenica wore was iron, dark, heavier than a modern key, roughly the length of a hand, with an ornate, old-fashioned bow at one end, the kind of design common to European locksmithing from well before the 20th century, suggesting that whatever door it opened, and whatever lock was fitted into that door, predated even the 1944 transformation that placed the key into Sister Domenica's care. That detail matters more than it might seem at first, because it suggests the vault itself, or at least the mechanism protecting it, was not something newly constructed during the war. It was something older, something already in existence, something that was simply repurposed, reactivated, or reassigned a new guardian during the specific chaos of 1944, which raises an entirely new question that none of the popular theories fully address. If the lock and the door predate the war, what was this space originally built for, and who guarded it before Sister Domenica ever set foot in that basement corridor? This is where the story connects, at least circumstantially, to a much older and much better documented pattern within Vatican-adjacent architecture, and that is the long history of religious buildings across Rome incorporating hidden storage spaces, escape routes, and concealed chambers dating back centuries, structures built during periods of genuine physical danger, invasions, sieges, political upheaval, when religious institutions needed places to hide valuables, documents, and sometimes people, from armies, from mobs, from rival political factions. Several such spaces have been documented, opened, and studied by historians over the years, their existence no longer secret, their purpose long since resolved by time and changing circumstances. It is entirely plausible, and several researchers who've looked closely at this story have proposed exactly this, that the space Sister Domenica guarded was originally one of these older, centuries-old hidden chambers, largely forgotten, unused for generations, until 1944, when the specific chaos of wartime Rome created a need, once again, for a private, secure, undocumented place to store something that could not risk exposure, and someone within the institution remembered, or rediscovered, that this old space still existed, still had its original lock intact, and simply needed a new key, and a new, trustworthy hand to carry it. If that's true, it reframes the entire story in a way I find strangely more haunting rather than less. It means Sister Domenica wasn't the first guardian of that space. She was simply the most recent in a line stretching back potentially centuries, a line of quiet, trusted individuals, generation after generation, era after era, chosen specifically for their discretion, their loyalty, and their willingness to carry a secret they may never have fully understood themselves. It means the carved word in the stone, Silentium, wasn't necessarily placed there in 1944 for her benefit. It may have been carved centuries earlier, for someone else entirely, someone whose name, whose story, whose sacrifice has been completely lost to history, the same way Sister Domenica's story very nearly was, the same way whoever came after her in 2001 may eventually be lost too, unless someone, somewhere, keeps asking the questions that this story keeps refusing to fully answer. There's a particular kind of historical parallel that researchers who study institutional secrecy often point to when discussing stories like this one, and it's worth mentioning here because it helps explain why an arrangement like Sister Domenica's isn't as isolated or unbelievable as it might initially sound. Throughout history, large, old institutions, not just religious ones, but also certain banking families, certain aristocratic estates, certain government archives, have occasionally relied on exactly this kind of single custodian model for their most sensitive material, precisely because it minimizes risk in a way that larger, more formal security systems cannot. A vault guarded by a security team requires payroll records, shift schedules, access logs, all of which create exactly the kind of paper trail that eventually leads to exposure. A vault guarded by one quiet, trusted, deeply loyal individual, someone embedded seamlessly into the ordinary rhythms of daily institutional life, creates almost no paper trail at all, precisely because that person's daily movements never look unusual to anyone who doesn't already know what to look for. It is, in a strange way, one of the most effective security systems ever devised, not because it's technologically sophisticated, but because it's almost invisible, hiding not behind locks and alarms, but behind the simple, overlooked ordinariness of a single human life. That's what makes this story so different from the kind of Vatican mystery content you might already be used to seeing elsewhere, the ones built around dramatic, cinematic imagery of underground chambers filled with ancient relics guarded by armed men in the dark. This story isn't cinematic at all, not really, not underneath the surface. It's quiet. It's administrative. It's built out of withdrawn municipal paperwork and half-remembered nighttime conversations and a single carved word in a stone doorframe that almost nobody who passed it ever noticed. And I think that quietness, that almost boring, bureaucratic ordinariness, is exactly what makes it so believable, because real institutional secrets, the ones that actually survive for decades without ever being fully exposed, rarely look like the secrets in movies. They look exactly like this, buried inside boring paperwork, hidden behind ordinary walls, carried by ordinary people who never once sought any attention for what they were quietly, faithfully protecting. And maybe that's ultimately what makes this story different from every other Vatican mystery you've probably heard before, the buried gold, the secret archives, the whispered conspiracies about hidden rooms full of treasure. Because this story was never really about what was behind that door. We may never know that, and honestly, at this point, I'm not sure knowing would even change how strange this story feels. This story is about a woman who was trusted with something so significant that an institution built an entire 50-year system of silence around her, and who carried that trust, without complaint, without explanation, without ever once breaking, until the very last day of her life, and then, within hours, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony, was replaced. If this is the first video of mine you've watched, I want you to understand something about why I make these, because it's not just about the mystery itself, it's about the people, almost always overlooked, almost always unnamed in the official record, who end up at the center of these secrets, And it's about how much of history isn't hidden in some elaborate conspiracy, it's hidden in plain sight, inside the quiet, boring, unremarkable paperwork of ordinary institutions, waiting for someone to actually read it closely enough to notice what doesn't add up. That's what this channel is built around. That's what The Secret Nun is all about, every single week, pulling these fragments together into stories the Church has never denied and never fully explained. And if that's the kind of thing that fascinates you the way it fascinates me, then this channel is exactly where you should be. So if you haven't already, subscribe now, because there are more stories like this one coming, and some of them, I promise you, go even deeper than this. Before you go, I want to hear from you, because a story like this always raises more questions than it answers, and I want to know which theory you find most convincing. Do you think it was wartime documents, something political, something that could still embarrass powerful people even today? Do you think it was something religious, an object too sacred and too fragile to ever be exposed to public scrutiny? Or do you think it was something far more grounded, financial records, the kind of paperwork institutions protect not because it's holy, but because it's dangerous in an entirely different way? Drop your theory in the comments below, because I read every single one, and some of the best leads I've ever followed up on for future videos came directly from viewers who noticed a detail I hadn't considered myself. And if this story genuinely got under your skin the way it got under mine while researching it, do me a favor and share it with someone, send it to a friend who loves a good mystery, post it somewhere, because stories like this only survive, only stay alive in public memory, when people keep talking about them. And honestly, after everything we've just gone through together, doesn't it feel a little bit wrong to let this one quietly disappear into silence too? Think, for a second, about how different this story would look if Sister Domenica had simply told someone, anyone, at any point across those 50 years. One conversation, one confession, one late-night moment of weakness where the weight of the secret finally became too heavy to carry alone, and this entire mystery would have ended decades ago, resolved, documented, closed. But she never did. Not to Sister Paula, who lived beside her for 18 years. Not to any recorded superior. Not, as far as we can tell, to anyone at all, ever, in her entire adult life. That kind of discipline is almost impossible to imagine in an age like ours, an age where privacy itself feels like an increasingly rare and fragile thing, where most secrets, however small, tend to surface eventually, through a careless comment, a moment of frustration, a slow erosion of resolve over time. Sister Domenica's resolve, whatever its source, never eroded, not once, not even at the very end of her life, when most people, facing their final years, tend to feel the pull toward confession, toward unburdening themselves before it's too late. If anything, the opposite happened. She held the silence more tightly the closer she came to the end, and when death finally did come for her, it came quietly, and the silence simply transferred, seamlessly, to whoever came next, exactly the way it was designed to from the very beginning. Because here's the thing that I haven't said yet, the thing that's been sitting underneath this entire story the whole time we've been talking, and it's this. Institutions like the Vatican do not build 50-year systems of silence around things that don't matter. They don't train replacements, dispatch quiet men within hours of a death, carve permanent instructions into solid stone, and maintain unwavering discretion across multiple generations of leadership, for something trivial. Whatever is behind that door, if it is even still there, if that door even still exists in the exact form Vittorio Bassano once stood in front of, it mattered enough in 1944 to require a 19-year-old girl to be quietly transformed into a lifelong guardian, and it apparently still matters enough today that no one, not one single person in over 60 years, has ever come forward to tell us what it is. And maybe that's the most honest ending I can give you, because not every mystery gets solved, and not every locked door gets opened, and sometimes the most unsettling stories aren't the ones with a dramatic final reveal, they're the ones that simply continue, quietly, in the background, exactly the way this one almost certainly still is, right now, somewhere inside those walls, behind a door carved with a single word that has outlasted everyone who ever tried to understand it. Silence. It was the instruction in 1944. It was the instruction for the 50 years that followed. And as far as anyone outside those walls can tell, it remains the instruction today. There's one last thought I want to leave you with before we close this out, something that occurred to me only after months of sitting with this research, turning it over, trying to find the angle I might have missed. Every version of this story we've discussed today, the wartime documents, the sacred relic, the financial records, the centuries-old hidden chamber repurposed in a moment of crisis, shares one quiet assumption underneath all of them. And that assumption is that whatever is behind that door was worth protecting because of what it could destroy if it got out: a reputation, a relationship, a belief, a legal claim. But there's a smaller, gentler possibility too, one that researchers rarely spend much time on because it doesn't make for quite as dramatic a story, and that is the possibility that whatever lies behind that door was never dangerous at all in the way we've been imagining, that it was simply personal, deeply personal, to someone whose identity has long since been lost to time, a private grief, a private vow, a private promise made in the middle of a war so chaotic that an entire institution decided the kindest, safest thing it could do was simply let that promise be kept in silence, forever, without ever needing to explain itself to anyone, including us. We may never know which version is true. Maybe nobody alive today does. But I think sitting with that uncertainty, rather than rushing past it toward whichever explanation feels most satisfying, is exactly what a story like this deserves, because Sister Domenica herself never rushed toward an explanation either, not once, not in 50 years. And if she could carry that kind of patience for an entire lifetime, the least we can do is sit with it for the length of one video. So the next time you walk past an old church, an old convent, any quiet religious building that's been standing for generations, I want you to remember this story, because you have no way of knowing what ordinary-looking door might be hiding something extraordinary behind it, and you have no way of knowing which quiet, unassuming person walking past you might be carrying a responsibility far heavier than anyone around them will ever realize. That's what makes stories like this one so unsettling, and honestly, so addictive to chase. It's not the grand conspiracy. It's the realization that the biggest secrets are so often kept by the smallest, quietest, most overlooked people in the room. I also think it's worth taking a moment to talk about the people who actually pieced this story together, because none of what we've discussed today came from a single dramatic exposé, a leaked document, or a whistleblower stepping into the spotlight demanding attention. It came, slowly, painstakingly, over the course of nearly 2 decades, from a loose, largely uncoordinated network of local historians, retired archivists, amateur genealogists, and a handful of journalists working small regional beats, the kind of people who rarely get credit for the discoveries they make, precisely because their work doesn't look glamorous from the outside. Someone spends months combing through microfilm in a municipal records office looking for something entirely unrelated, and stumbles across a withdrawal notice that doesn't quite make sense. Someone else interviews an elderly relative for an unrelated family history project, and ends up recording a detail that means nothing to them personally, but means everything once it's placed alongside dozens of other similarly small, similarly overlooked fragments. This is how stories like Sister Domenica's actually get uncovered in the real world, not through dramatic break-ins or stolen files, but through the slow, patient accumulation of small, boring pieces of paper, cross-referenced by people who were simply curious enough, and stubborn enough, to keep asking why something didn't quite add up. It took years for anyone to even notice that Vittorio Bassano's 1988 newspaper interview, Sister Paola Ricci's 1990s oral history recording, and Father Calus's early 2000s resignation were even connected to each other at all. For a long time, they existed as 3 completely separate, unrelated footnotes, scattered across different archives, different regions, different research projects, each one meaningless in isolation. It was only when a small group of independent researchers began systematically cataloguing unusual, unexplained incidents connected to Vatican-adjacent properties throughout the 20th century, a project that began, honestly, almost as a hobby, that anyone noticed the pattern at all: the consistent physical description of the nun, the consistent language around the hidden door, the consistent, unmistakable thread running through witnesses who had never met each other, never spoken to each other, and in most cases, never even knew the others existed. That kind of convergence, 3, 4, 5 independent sources, decades apart, arriving at strikingly consistent details without any possibility of having coordinated their stories beforehand, is exactly the kind of evidence that serious historians take seriously, even when, as is unavoidably the case here, a definitive, fully documented conclusion remains permanently out of reach. I think that's part of why this story has stayed with me the way it has, more than almost any other story I've researched for this channel. It's not a story with a villain you can point to, or a treasure you can imagine finding, or a clean, satisfying twist waiting at the end. It's a story about the slow, quiet accumulation of small, honest human testimony, pieced together by people with no financial incentive, no dramatic agenda, nothing to gain except the simple satisfaction of finally understanding a small piece of the truth a little more clearly than they did before. And in a strange way, that mirrors exactly what Sister Domenica herself represents in this story. The idea that some of the most important work in the world happens quietly, without recognition, without applause, carried out by people who never expected anyone to notice, and who, in her case at least, very nearly succeeded in making sure nobody ever did. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, I genuinely appreciate you, because I know this wasn't a quick watch, and I know it asked you to sit with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unanswered questions, and honestly, that discomfort is exactly what makes a story like this worth telling. Make sure you're subscribed to The Secret Nun so you don't miss the next one. Drop your theory in the comments, tell me honestly what you think that key opened, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and I will see you in the next story, where we go looking for the next thing the Church has never officially acknowledged, but has also, somehow, never quite managed to deny.